When Navy SEAL Marcus Johnson faced racism in a parking lot dispute, he didn't need his military training to fight back. His dignity delivered the most devastating counterattack the couple never saw coming. The busy suburban shopping center parking lot was nearly full as Marcus Johnson, a 35-year-old African-American man with an athletic build and disciplined demeanor, drove slowly through looking for a space. His modest sit-in moved carefully between the rows of parked cars until he finally spotted an empty space. He signaled to turn in, relief washing over his face after circling for so long. Just as Marcus began to pull in, a large SUV suddenly accelerated and cut him off, taking the spot with a screech of tires. Marcus hit his brakes, surprised by the aggressive maneuver. He watched as Karen Weber, a 45-year-old well-dressed white woman, emerged from the driver's side of the SUV. Her husband, Greg Weber, a 47-year-old imposing white man, exited from the passenger side, stretching as though they had all the time in the world. Marcus pulled up alongside the SUV and rolled down his window. "Excuse me," he called out politely but firmly. "I was signaling to take that spot." Karen turned, sizing Marcus up with a dismissive glance that made it clear she had already judged him. "Well, we're here now," she replied with a shrug. "There are plenty of other spots." Her tone suggested she considered the matter closed. "Actually, I've been circling for 10 minutes, Marcus explained calmly. "I was clearly indicating to take the space." He kept his voice level, hoping to resolve the situation without escalation. Greg, sensing the tension, walked around the SUV and positioned himself between Marcus and Karen, his body language protective and confrontational. "You heard my wife. Find another spot. This one's taken," Greg said aggressively, crossing his arms and staring down at Marcus. His stance made it clear he was ready for a fight. Marcus noticed a "Support our Tiru Pez" bumper sticker on the SUV and took a deep breath. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Marcus said, still maintaining his composure despite the rising tension. What the couple didn't know was that Marcus was a decorated Navy SEAL, having served 3 tours overseas. He had faced far worse situations than an argument over a parking space. "Sir, ma'am, I respectfully ask you to reconsider. We can resolve this civilly." Marcus tried again, his military training evident in how he handled the confrontation. Greg stepped closer to Marcus's car window. "Listen, boy," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to move along. People like you are always looking for handouts and special treatment." The racial undertone in his words was unmistakable, cutting through the air like a knife. Karen joined her husband, her designer purse clutched tightly against her chest. "Greg, be careful. You don't know what he might do," she said loudly enough for Marcus to hear, casting a nervous glance around as though looking for witnesses or security. Her implication was clear and deeply hurtful. Marcus felt a familiar surge of anger, but controlled it as he had been trained to do in high-pressure situations. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll find another spot." He began to roll up his window, deciding that this battle wasn't worth fighting. As a black man in America, he had learned when to engage and when to walk away. As Marcus drove away to find another parking space, an elderly woman who had witnessed the entire exchange approached the couple. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. "That young man was waiting for the spot first, and you know it." Greg and Karen brushed off the woman's comments, hurrying toward the shopping center entrance. Inside the mall, Marcus was at the customer service desk of an electronics store when a commotion broke out near the entrance. Security guards rushed past, and curious shoppers gathered to see what was happening. Marcus followed, his instincts kicking in, ready to help if needed. In the parking lot, Marcus found a crowd gathered around the Webers' SUV. Someone had witnessed the couple's behavior and recognized Marcus from a recent local news feature about veterans giving back to the community. The story had spread quickly through the shopping center, and now several veterans who happened to be shopping that day had surrounded the couple's vehicle. The atmosphere in the parking lot had shifted dramatically in the 7 minutes since Marcus had walked away from the confrontation. What had begun as a simple dispute over a parking space had transformed into something far more significant, a moment of public reckoning. The commotion drew attention from across the shopping center as people gathered around the Weber's SUV, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Among them were several veterans who had recognized Marcus from his community work, their expressions hardening as they pieced together what had transpired. Marcus approached the scene cautiously, his military training evident in his measured steps and alert eyes. He hadn't sought this confrontation or its aftermath, but he recognized when a situation required his presence. The crowd parted naturally as he approached, whispers following in his wake. "That's him," someone murmured. "That's Commander Johnson." The respect in their voices was unmistakable, creating a stark contrast to the treatment he had received minutes earlier. Greg and Karen Weber stood beside their SUV, increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd's energy focused on them. Greg's earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a defensive posture that betrayed his growing unease. Karen clutched her designer purse even tighter now, her knuckles white with tension. The couple who had been so dismissive, so confident in their perceived superiority, now looked small and vulnerable amid the gathering crowd. "Is it true you disrespected a Navy SEAL?" The question came from a middle-aged man wearing a Desert Storm veteran's cap, his voice carrying across the parking lot with the clarity of someone accustomed to command. The directness of the question left no room for evasion, forcing Greg to confront the implications of his actions head-on. Greg's face drained of color as the realization dawned that the man he had belittled was not just any man, but someone who had served their country with distinction. Another veteran stepped forward, a woman in her 30s with a composed demeanor that spoke of military service. "We saw your bumper sticker," she said, pointing to the Support Our Tirupes emblem proudly displayed on their SUV. "You support troops until they're black, is that it?" Her question hung in the air like an indictment, laying bare the hypocrisy that many in the crowd had already sensed. The juxtaposition of the couple's proclaimed patriotism and their treatment of an actual service member created a cognitive dissonance that was impossible to ignore. Karen, sensing the deteriorating situation, attempted to intervene. "We had no idea who he was," she protested, her voice pitched higher than normal, betraying her anxiety. The defense sounded hollow even to her own ears, an inadvertent admission that knowledge of Marcus's service might have changed their behavior, suggesting that respect was conditional rather than universal. This only intensified the crowd's disapproval as murmurs of dissent rippled through the gathering. The mall's security chief, a former Marine with a commanding presence enhanced by his crisp uniform, made his way through the crowd with practiced efficiency. At 52, Chief Rodriguez carried himself with the dignity of his military background, his salt and pepper hair cropped short and his eyes missing nothing as he assessed the situation. He had reviewed the security footage moments earlier, the high-definition cameras capturing every detail of the confrontation, from Marcus's signal to turn into the parking space to Greg's aggressive posturing and Karen's thinly veiled prejudice. "We've reviewed the security footage," Chief Rodriguez announced, his voice calm but authoritative, silencing the crowd. "What I saw was disturbing. Not only did you take a spot that wasn't yours, but the language you used afterward constitutes harassment in this establishment." His words carried the weight of official judgment, transforming the court of public opinion into something more consequential. The chief's presence legitimized the gathering, lending institutional backing to the community's response. Greg shifted uncomfortably, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "This is getting blown way out of proportion," he muttered, but his protest lacked conviction. The crowd's silence in response spoke volumes, more damning than any verbal rebuke could have been. Karen placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm, sensing that further protestations would only deepen their predicament. The crowd continued to grow, drawn by the spectacle unfolding in the parking lot. Among them were people of all backgrounds, a cross-section of America itself, united in their disapproval of what they had witnessed or heard described. Some recorded the scene on their phones, modern witnesses to a tale of prejudice and its consequences. The Webers were no longer anonymous aggressors in a parking dispute. They had become the subjects of a public moral reckoning, their actions preserved and potentially shared beyond this immediate gathering. An older white man with weathered features and a Vietnam veteran cap pushed through the crowd, his age belying the strength in his movements. Harold Thompson had served in the 173rd Airborne Brigade combat team during Vietnam, and the experiences of that distant conflict had shaped his worldview in ways that transcended the racial divisions of his generation. He had known Marcus for years through the local Veterans Affairs office, where Marcus volunteered despite his busy schedule. "That man you just disrespected," Harold said, pointing toward Marcus, "has saved more American lives than you'll ever know." His voice quavered slightly, not from weakness, but from the emotional weight of his words. "He leads the veteran support group that helped my son after he came back from Afghanistan with PTSD so bad he couldn't leave his room for months." Harold's testimony transformed Marcus from an abstract figure, a black man in a parking lot, into a multi-dimensional human being whose contributions had touched countless lives, including those of white veterans and their families. A hushed silence fell over the crowd as Harold's words sank in. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore, or even about the racial slurs that had been thinly disguised as confrontational banter. This was about the disconnect between performative patriotism, exemplified by bumper stickers and flag waving, and genuine respect for those who embodied the values such symbols were meant to represent. Several other veterans in the crowd nodded in solemn agreement with Harold's assessment. Among them was Letitia Williams, a former Army medic who had served alongside Marcus during one particularly harrowing deployment. "Commander Johnson led a rescue mission that pulled my unit out when we were pinned down near Kandahar," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "He never once asked about the race, religion, or politics of any soldier he risked his life to save." Her testimony added another layer to the unfolding narrative, highlighting the absurdity of judging a man like Marcus based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The stories continued to emerge from the crowd, each one adding depth to the portrait of Marcus Johnson, not as a victim of discrimination, but as a hero whose accomplishments and character had earned him the respect now being vocally expressed. A young man described how Marcus had mentored him through the Naval Academy application process. An elderly woman recounted how Marcus had organized a home repair initiative for veterans living alone. These weren't just character witnesses, they were living testaments to a life of service that extended far beyond military duty. Throughout this impromptu testimony, Marcus stood quietly, neither encouraging nor discouraging the outpouring. His eyes occasionally met those of Greg and Karen Weber, not with triumph or vindication, but with a steady gaze that invited reflection. This moment wasn't about humiliation for Marcus, it was about growth, the possibility that from this uncomfortable confrontation might emerge a deeper understanding. Local news reporter Sophia Chen, who happened to be at the mall researching a story on retail trends, recognized the significance of what was unfolding. With practiced discretion, she began documenting the scene, her journalistic instincts telling her that this spontaneous community response represented something important about the current social climate. This wasn't just a human interest story. It was a window into how communities could hold individuals accountable for prejudice in real time without violence or excessive vitriol. The security footage, now being reviewed on a tablet by another security officer who had joined Chief Rodriguez, revealed additional details of the confrontation. The officer pointed out how Marcus had maintained a respectful demeanor throughout, even as Gray had leaned aggressively into his personal space. The contrast between Marcus's composure and the couple's hostility was stark, undermining any attempt they might make to portray themselves as the victims in this scenario. "The camera doesn't lie," Chief Rodriguez commented, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And it doesn't see color, just actions." His simple observation cut through potential arguments about perspective or misinterpretation. The evidence was clear, documented in high definition for anyone to review. Technology had become an impartial witness, capturing truth in a way that left little room for denial or revisionist accounts. As the implications of their actions became increasingly clear to the Webers, their body language began to shift. Greg's aggressive stance had completely dissolved, replaced by a slouched posture that suggested defeat. Karen's face flushed with a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment certainly, but perhaps also the first flickers of genuine shame as she recognized how their behavior appeared through the eyes of others. The revelation wasn't just about Marcus's identity as a Navy SEAL, though that had been the catalyst. It was about the community's refusal to silently accept prejudice, their collective decision to stand as witnesses and speak as judges of behavior they deemed unacceptable. In an era often characterized by division and disconnection, this spontaneous gathering represented something more hopeful: the capacity of ordinary people to unite across differences when core values were violated. Several younger veterans who had served in more recent conflicts stood together at the edge of the crowd, their presence a reminder that military service in America was increasingly diverse. They represented various ethnicities, genders, and backgrounds, united by their shared experience of service. Their silent solidarity spoke volumes about the inclusive reality of modern American armed forces, contrasting sharply with the outdated prejudices the Webbers had displayed. Commander Johnson received the Silver Star for valor under fire, offered a man in a wheelchair, his prosthetic leg visible beneath his shorts. Michael Dawson had served as a combat medic until an IED had changed the trajectory of his life 3 years ago. He carried 2 wounded men through enemy fire after our convoy was hit, never left anyone behind. His testimony added yet another dimension to the unfolding portrait of Marcus, not just community leader and mentor, but a battle-tested hero whose courage under fire had saved American lives. As these stories accumulated, the abstract concept of respecting troops that the Webbers had signaled with their bumper sticker was transformed into something concrete and personal. They were now face to face with the reality of what service meant, embodied in the diverse group of veterans who had gathered to support one of their own. The hollow nature of their performative patriotism was exposed in the harsh light of authentic service and sacrifice. The community's response represented something beyond mere public shaming. It was a collective assertion of values, a demonstration that respect wasn't just a polite fiction, but a moral imperative grounded in recognition of human dignity. As witnesses and participants in this impromptu moment of accountability, each person present was both affirming their commitment to these values and modeling them for others who might hear of this incident secondhand. In the space of just 7 minutes, the time it had taken Marcus to walk away, for word to spread, and for the community to gather, an ordinary parking dispute had been transformed into an extraordinary moment of social reckoning. The revelation of Marcus's identity had been the catalyst, but the response it generated revealed something more profound about the community itself, its capacity to recognize injustice and respond with moral clarity rather than indifference. Karen Webber's face flushed a deep crimson as the full weight of public scrutiny descended upon her. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained throughout her adult life, the image of a respectable, upper-middle-class woman who donated to charities and attended community functions, was crumbling before her eyes. Standing in that parking lot, surrounded by disapproving faces, she felt exposed in a way she never had before. This wasn't like receiving a sideways glance for a fashion faux pas or overhearing gossip about her landscaping choices. This was different, raw, immediate, and impossible to rationalize away. The reflection she saw in the eyes of the gathered crowd didn't match the person she believed herself to be, and that cognitive dissonance created a profound discomfort that manifested physically as a knot in her stomach and a burning sensation across her cheeks and neck. Greg Webber, meanwhile, struggled to maintain the last vestiges of his composure. Throughout his life, he had relied on a certain forceful confidence to navigate difficult situations. Whether in business negotiations or personal conflicts, his strategy had always been the same: never back down, never admit fault, and maintain the offensive. That approach had served him well in boardrooms and neighborhood disputes alike. But here, in this very public arena, those tactics weren't just failing, they were backfiring spectacularly. Each attempt to justify or defend their actions only seemed to deepen the hole they were digging for themselves. The evidence against them was overwhelming, not just the security footage, but the testimony of multiple witnesses and the unmistakable facts of what had transpired just minutes ago. "This is ridiculous," Greg finally managed, his voice straining to project confidence he no longer felt. "We just took a parking spot. It happens every day." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, a desperate attempt to reduce what had happened to its most innocuous elements, stripping away the context and subtext that had transformed a minor parking dispute into something far more revealing about character and values. His statement hung in the air for a moment, met with silence that felt more damning than any verbal rebuke could have been. Chief Rodriguez, the security officer, stepped forward again, his presence commanding attention without theatrics. His 20 years in the Marine Corps had taught him much about leadership, including when to be firm and when to be compassionate. This situation called for the former. "It's not about the parking spot anymore," he explained, his tone measured but unyielding. "It's about how you treated a fellow human being." He paused, allowing the message to sink in before continuing. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." With a gesture toward the exit, he delivered the final consequence. "Your vehicle has been photographed, and you're not welcome back at this shopping center." The finality of this judgment landed like a physical blow. For the Webbers, this shopping center wasn't just any retail establishment, it was their preferred destination, conveniently located near their suburban home, housing the stores they frequented and the restaurants they enjoyed. Being banned represented not just a practical inconvenience, but a social exile from a space they had considered part of their domain. More significantly, it marked a permanent record of their transgression. Their vehicle, a luxury SUV they had chosen partly for its status symbolism, was now documented in the center's security system not as a signifier of success, but as a marker of shame. The crowd that had gathered maintained a respectful distance, forming a loose semicircle that allowed the situation to unfold without descending into mob mentality. These weren't spectators at a public shaming, they were witnesses to a necessary reckoning, their presence ensuring that accountability would not be evaded through denial or minimization. Among them were people of various backgrounds and ages, a cross-section of the community itself, united not by demographic similarities, but by a shared understanding of basic human dignity and respect. As the Webbers reluctantly turned toward their vehicle, a path cleared before them. There was no jostling, no verbal abuse from the crowd, just the weight of collective judgment expressed through silence and unwavering gazes. This wasn't the angry mob that Greg might have portrayed in later retellings to sympathetic ears. It was something more civilized yet no less powerful, a community standing firm in its values without resorting to the very behaviors it condemned. It was at this moment that Marcus emerged from the back of the crowd. He had been observing quietly, processing the situation with the analytical mind that had served him well both in military operations and in civilian life afterward. As a leader, he had learned that intervention required careful timing. Too soon, and you might interrupt a necessary process. Too late, and an opportunity for meaningful resolution could be lost. Now, sensing that the moment was right, he stepped forward with the quiet confidence that characterized his movements both on and off the battlefield. The security chief spotted him immediately. "Commander Johnson," he called out, the respect in his voice unmistakable. "I apologize for what happened here today." The title, Commander, carried weight beyond its military significance. It acknowledged Marcus's status not just as a veteran, but as a leader whose authority derived from character and service rather than mere rank or position. Marcus acknowledged the apology with a nod, but didn't dwell on it. His focus was elsewhere, on the couple who had, just minutes earlier, dismissed him as unworthy of basic courtesy based solely on his appearance. Now, as they reached their vehicle, keys in hand and eyes downcast, he approached them with measured steps. The crowd fell silent, anticipating what might come next. Would he demand further apology? Express righteous anger? Deliver a lecture on racism and its consequences? Instead, Marcus did something unexpected. He spoke quietly, his voice pitched so that only the Webbers could hear clearly. "Mr. and Mrs. Webber," he began, using their names despite not having been formally introduced, a small detail that registered with both of them, a reminder that their identities were now known while his had been dismissed. "I don't want your day ruined over this. I just want you to understand something. The uniform I wore for this country wasn't white or black, it was American. And when I was in combat, I would have given my life to protect you both, without ever asking what you looked like or how you voted." The simplicity and sincerity of this statement cut through the defensive barriers Greg had been maintaining. For the first time since the confrontation began, he found himself unable to meet Marcus's gaze, not out of defiance, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame that surprised him with its intensity. This wasn't the abstract, performative guilt that sometimes accompanied public call-outs. This was something more visceral and authentic, a genuine recognition of having failed to live up to values he claimed to uphold. Karen, meanwhile, found herself looking directly at Marcus, tears welling in her eyes. These weren't strategic tears designed to evoke sympathy or deflect criticism. They emerged from a place of genuine emotional reckoning. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words emerging before she had fully processed the intention to speak them. "We were wrong." The admission was simple but profound, an acknowledgement not just of a mistake in judgment, but of a fundamental failure of character in that moment. "Thank you for saying that," Marcus replied, his tone neither triumphant nor condescending. "That's all I needed to hear." There was a dignity in his acceptance of their apology that made it impossible to dismiss it as mere political correctness or conflict avoidance. This was a man who understood the value of reconciliation, not as weakness but as strength, as the difficult but necessary foundation for any meaningful progress. Marcus turned to Chief Rodriguez, who had been standing nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. "Sir, if it's all the same to you, I'd prefer if these folks could stay and finish their shopping. I believe we've all learned something today." This request wasn't made lightly or without consideration of its implications. Marcus understood that forgiveness without consequences could enable continued harmful behavior. But he also recognized that transformation required opportunity, the chance to do better after recognizing one's failings. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. After witnessing the Webbers' behavior and the subsequent revelation of Marcus's identity, many had expected, perhaps even hoped for, a more punitive resolution. There is something satisfying about seeing justice delivered in clear, unambiguous terms, especially when the offense seems so blatant. Marcus's request for leniency challenged that expectation, inviting the community to consider a more nuanced understanding of accountability and growth. Chief Rodriguez considered the request thoughtfully. As head of security, he had both policy and precedent to consider. The shopping center had clear guidelines about disruptive behavior, and the Webbers had unquestionably violated those standards. Yet he also recognized the wisdom in Marcus's approach. After a moment's reflection, he nodded, his respect for the former SEAL evident in his deference to the request. "If that's what you want, Commander Johnson, we can make an exception this time." As the tension began to dissolve, Marcus extended his hand to Greg, a simple gesture laden with significance. It wasn't offered from a position of moral superiority or as a demand for submission. Rather, it was an invitation to reconnection, to the recognition of shared humanity despite the gulf of understanding that had been revealed in their earlier interaction. After a moment's hesitation, Greg took the offered hand, his grip firm but his eyes still downcast in shame. "Second chances are important," Marcus said, speaking now so that others nearby could hear as well. "I got plenty of them overseas. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit when you're wrong and try to do better next time." These weren't empty platitudes or rehearsed lines from a self-help manual. They emerged from the lived experience of someone who had faced life and death situations, who understood the real meaning of courage and the importance of growth through adversity. The handshake between the two men lasted only seconds but represented something profound, not the erasure of what had happened, but the possibility of moving forward with greater awareness and intention. Greg's hand trembled slightly as he withdrew it, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't expected to experience in a shopping center parking lot on what had begun as an ordinary Saturday afternoon. As Marcus walked away, heading back to the store to complete his errand, the crowd dispersed gradually. There was no dramatic conclusion, no swelling music or final confrontation, just the quiet dissolution of a moment that had, for a brief time, transformed a mundane public space into an arena for moral reckoning. The absence of spectacle in this resolution was itself meaningful, suggesting that the work of addressing prejudice and fostering understanding isn't always dramatic or performative. Often, it happens in small moments of recognition and choice that pass largely unnoticed by the wider world. Karen and Greg Webber remained by their SUV for several minutes after the crowd had dispersed, neither speaking nor making eye contact. Both were processing what had just occurred, though in different ways and through different emotional landscapes. For Karen, the experience had cracked open a self-image she had maintained for decades. She had never considered herself racist, Indeed, she would have been offended by the suggestion. She donated to humanitarian causes, volunteered at her church's food pantry, and made a point of being polite to everyone she encountered. Yet in that crucial moment in the parking lot, something else had emerged, assumptions and fears she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. Greg's reflection was more complex, tangled with issues of masculinity and authority that had shaped his approach to conflict throughout his life. His initial aggressive response hadn't been solely about race. It had also been about dominance, about winning a perceived competition for resources, in this case, a parking space. Yet he couldn't deny that race had influenced how easily he had dismissed Marcus's legitimate claim, how quickly he had escalated to intimidation rather than reasoning. The realization was uncomfortable, challenging core aspects of his identity as a fair-minded, reasonable person. As they finally entered their vehicle, the "Support our Tihorupe's" bumper sticker caught Greg's eye in the side view mirror. What had once seemed like a straightforward expression of patriotic values now felt complicated by the day's events. What did it mean to support troops if that support extended only to those who looked a certain way or fit a particular image of what a service member should be? How could he reconcile his claimed values with his demonstrated behavior? These questions wouldn't be answered in the aftermath of a single incident, no matter how revealing or transformative. Real change would require ongoing reflection, education, and conscious effort to align actions with ideals. For the Webbers, the parking lot confrontation represented a potential turning point, an opportunity to examine biases they had denied or minimized, to consider how such attitudes shaped their interactions with others in ways both obvious and subtle. As they sat in their luxury SUV, surrounded by the trappings of material success, both recognized that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of themselves and their place in the community. The consequences they faced, the temporary ban from the shopping center, the public exposure of their behavior, the shame of being confronted with their own prejudice, weren't punishments imposed from outside so much as natural results of choices they had made. And in that recognition lay the possibility of growth, not guaranteed, but available to them should they choose to embrace it. Meanwhile, Marcus continued about his day, the incident already receding in his immediate concerns. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, and he harbored no illusions that it would be the last. Yet he carried with him a quiet satisfaction, not in the public vindication or the couple's discomfort, but in the possibility that the encounter might have planted seeds of change. As a military leader, he had learned that transformation often began with disruption, with the challenging of assumptions and the confrontation of uncomfortable truths. Whether that disruption led to growth or entrenchment depended on many factors, some beyond his control or influence. What remained within his power was his own response, his choice to maintain dignity without surrendering to bitterness, to offer second chances without enabling harmful behavior, to recognize humanity even in those who had momentarily failed to see his. These weren't choices made out of weakness or fear, but from a place of hard-won wisdom and strength. In that parking lot, facing prejudice with composure and responding to shame with grace, Marcus had demonstrated a form of courage different from, but no less significant than that which he had shown on the battlefield. The weeks following the parking lot incident unfolded in unexpected ways for all involved. For Greg and Karen Weber, what could have been dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment, an unpleasant but ultimately forgettable altercation, instead became a catalyst for profound self-examination. The morning after, Greg sat alone on their back deck, coffee cooling beside him untouched, replaying the confrontation in his mind. Each recollection brought fresh waves of shame that no amount of rationalization could dispel. He had always considered himself a good person, hardworking, law-abiding, generous to selected charities during the holiday season. The image in the security footage of himself leaning aggressively toward Marcus's car window, voice lowered to deliver words he now couldn't bear to recall, contradicted everything he wanted to believe about himself. The dissonance was both uncomfortable and necessary. Karen's process was different, but no less significant. She had spent decades perfecting a particular social persona, the capable, confident suburban wife whose immaculate home and carefully curated wardrobe projected success and stability. That identity had never before been so publicly challenged or found so fundamentally wanting. The tears she had shed in the parking lot had continued in private, not as a performance of remorse, but as a genuine emotional release that surprised her with its intensity. She found herself unable to make eye contact with the housekeeper, a Salvadoran woman who had worked for them for 7 years, and whose name Karen had only recently bothered to learn correctly. Small interactions that she had previously navigated on autopilot now felt laden with implication, requiring conscious attention rather than habitual response. 3 days after the incident, Greg made a decision that would have been unthinkable the week before. He called the Veterans Center where Marcus volunteered, inquiring awkwardly about making a donation. The receptionist, unaware of the connection, transferred him to the program director, who recognized the Weber name immediately from staff discussions about the now widely circulated parking lot video. There was a moment of tense silence before the director spoke. "Mr. Weber, we appreciate the gesture, but I should tell you that Commander Johnson has been quite clear that he doesn't want this incident used for publicity, positive or negative." The implied question hung unspoken. Was this donation an attempt at public image rehabilitation or something more genuine? Greg swallowed hard before responding. "I understand," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "This isn't about publicity. To be honest, I'd prefer if no one knew about it at all. He paused, struggling to articulate a motivation he was still coming to understand himself. "I need to do something that matters. Not to fix what happened. I know it's not that simple, but maybe to start doing better going forward." The director, hearing the authenticity in Greg's halting explanation, agreed to accept the donation with the stipulation that it would be anonymous and directed specifically toward the PTSD support program that had helped Harold Thompson's son and many others like him. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his normal routine: morning runs along the river, his civilian job as an engineering consultant, evening classes toward his MBA, and weekend hours at the Veterans Center. If the incident had affected him deeply, he showed few outward signs. Those who knew him well, however, noticed subtle changes. He spoke more frequently in the veterans group sessions he facilitated, sharing personal experiences with prejudice that he had previously kept private. These weren't performative displays of vulnerability but thoughtful reflections offered when they might help another veteran process similar experiences or understand a perspective different from their own. When questioned directly about the viral video by colleagues or acquaintances, Marcus redirected the conversation with practiced ease. "There's more to those people than their worst moment," he would say, "just like there's more to me than being a Navy SEAL or a black man who experienced discrimination." This wasn't denial or avoidance, but a deliberate choice to resist the flattening of human complexity into simplified narratives of heroes and villains, a resistance born of his own frustration with being reduced to either his race or his service, never fully seen as the multidimensional person he was. The shopping center itself became an unexpected site of transformation. Chief Rodriguez, recognizing an opportunity to address systemic issues rather than isolated incidents, initiated a comprehensive review of security protocols and staff training. The emphasis shifted from reactive enforcement to proactive community building, with new guidelines for intervention in potentially discriminatory situations. Security personnel received enhanced training on de-escalation techniques and unconscious bias awareness. What had begun as a single confrontation between individuals was expanding into institutional change, rippling outward from that initial point of contact. Local journalist Sophia Chen, who had witnessed and documented the parking lot confrontation, developed it into a nuanced feature story for the regional newspaper. Rather than sensationalizing the incident or indulging in public shaming, she contextualized it within broader patterns of everyday discrimination and community response. The article included interviews with security experts, civil rights advocates, and behavioral psychologists, exploring how seemingly minor interactions could reveal deeper societal fractures. Marcus declined to be interviewed directly, but provided a brief written statement emphasizing the importance of second chances and the possibility of growth through uncomfortable realizations. The article prompted a series of community forums hosted by the local library, exploring themes of bias, accountability, and reconciliation. The first session drew an unexpected crowd. People of various ages, ethnicities, and political leanings, united by curiosity and a tentative willingness to engage with difficult questions. The conversation wasn't always comfortable, but it was consistently respectful, guided by facilitators trained in navigating sensitive topics. Participants shared personal experiences of both witnessing and engaging in discriminatory behavior, discussing how communities might respond in ways that encouraged growth rather than merely punish transgressions. Karen Weber attended the second forum, slipping quietly into a seat in the back row. She didn't speak during the formal discussion, but afterward approached the facilitator with questions about recommended reading on unconscious bias. Her presence required courage, not the dramatic, cinematic kind celebrated in movies, but the quieter courage of facing uncomfortable truths without defensiveness or denial. She was beginning to understand that the transformation ahead would be neither quick nor easy, involving not just changed behavior, but a fundamental reassessment of assumptions she had never before questioned. 6 weeks after the incident, Marcus was working at the Veterans Center when he looked up to see Greg Weber standing uncertainly in the doorway of the common room. The space fell silent as recognition spread, veterans exchanging glances loaded with meaning. Greg cleared his throat. "I called ahead," he said, addressing his words to Marcus while acutely aware of the watchful eyes around him. "They said volunteers are welcome on Saturdays." The statement was both explanation and question. Was he welcome here, in this space, after what had happened? Marcus studied him for a long moment before responding. This wasn't about public performance of forgiveness or rehabilitation of Greg's image. This was about whether genuine change was possible and worth nurturing. "We can always use another pair of hands," he said finally, gesturing toward a stack of care packages being assembled for deployed service members. "Especially if they're attached to someone willing to learn." The conditional welcome acknowledged both possibility and requirement. Greg would need to earn his place in this community through consistent action over time, not through a single gesture or apology. The following months brought subtle but significant changes in the Weber household. Greg's Saturday mornings at the Veterans Center became a regular commitment, evolving from awkward obligation to meaningful engagement. Karen enrolled in a community college course on social justice history, her initial discomfort gradually giving way to genuine intellectual curiosity. Their dinner conversations shifted from neighborhood gossip and work complaints to discussions of articles they had read or perspectives they were reconsidering. These weren't performative displays for public consumption, but private reckonings happening behind closed doors, away from the validation or criticism of outside observers. The transformation wasn't linear or without setbacks. Old habits of thought and speech reasserted themselves in moments of stress or inattention. Greg still sometimes caught himself making assumptions based on appearance. Karen still occasionally retreated into privileged insularity when confronting uncomfortable realities became too overwhelming. The difference wasn't perfection but awareness. The growing ability to recognize these patterns as they emerge, rather than acting on them unconsciously. Each recognition provided an opportunity for course correction, for choosing a different response than the one that would have once seemed automatic. For Marcus, the incident and its aftermath reinforced lessons he had learned through military service and civilian life thereafter, that meaningful change happened not through dramatic confrontations but through consistent, intentional action over time. That transformation required both accountability and opportunity, and that judging others by their worst moments denied the possibility of growth he would want extended to himself. These weren't naive beliefs in easy redemption, but hard-earned insights into human complexity and the difficult, necessary work of building genuine understanding across differences of experience and perspective. The Veterans Center itself was transformed by Greg's presence and the conversations his involvement prompted. Initial skepticism from some members, particularly those who had witnessed or experienced similar discriminatory incidents, gradually shifted as Greg demonstrated genuine commitment through reliable attendance and increasingly thoughtful participation. He didn't center himself or his journey, but listened more than he spoke, especially on topics where his experience was limited. When he did contribute, it was often to acknowledge mistakes or misconceptions he was working to correct rather than to seek praise for his efforts. An unexpected friendship developed between Greg and Harold Thompson, the Vietnam veteran whose son had benefited from Marcus's PTSD support program. Their initial interactions were strained, weighted by the memory of Harold's public rebuke in the parking lot. But shared tasks created space for cautious conversation, which gradually expanded to include personal histories and perspectives. Harold, who had faced his own journey of unlearning racial prejudice decades earlier, recognized in Greg a genuine desire to change and offered guidance without absolution. "Understanding doesn't happen overnight," he told Greg during a coffee break between volunteer shifts. "It's something you build day by day, choice by choice. The important thing is that you keep choosing it, especially when it's uncomfortable." 6 months after the parking lot confrontation, a local nonprofit organized a community dialogue on race relations, featuring a panel of diverse speakers including academics, activists, and community leaders. Marcus, whose reputation as a thoughtful voice on difficult issues had grown, was invited to participate. During the question and answer session, an audience member asked about forgiveness and accountability, how communities could encourage meaningful change while still holding individuals responsible for harmful actions. Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "In the military, we understand that accountability isn't about punishment, it's about growth," he began. "When a teammate makes a mistake, we address it directly because lives depend on improvement, not because we want them to suffer." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I believe the same principle applies to addressing prejudice. The goal isn't to shame people into silence, but to create conditions where they can become better, more aware, more compassionate, more willing to examine their assumptions. That requires both honesty about harmful behavior and willingness to recognize genuine efforts to change." As he spoke, Marcus noticed Karen Weber sitting midway through the audience, notebook open, pen poised above the page. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, not in confrontation or discomfort, but in simple acknowledgement of shared humanity and the ongoing work of transformation. There was no dramatic moment of reconciliation, no public declaration of forgiveness or redemption. Just two individuals navigating the complex terrain of human growth, each changed in ways both visible and invisible by a chance encounter in a parking lot that could have ended very differently. The true transformation wasn't captured in any viral video or newspaper article. It happened in quiet moments of reflection and choice, Greg pausing to question an automatic judgment about a young man with tattoos and a hoodie, Karen initiating a conversation with their housekeeper about her family and aspirations, Marcus sharing his parking lot experience with a young black sailor struggling with similar incidents. These weren't performative acts designed for public approval, but authentic responses emerging from shifted perspectives, evidence not of completed change, but of ongoing commitment to growth. A year after the incident, the shopping center where it had occurred implemented a community engagement initiative developed in consultation with Chief Rodriguez and local civil rights organizations. The program included public art installations celebrating diversity, designated community gathering spaces, and regular cultural events designed to bring together different segments of the population that might otherwise remain separate despite geographic proximity. What had begun as a confrontation over a parking space had evolved into a catalyst for reimagining public space as an opportunity for connection rather than conflict. During one such event, a multicultural food festival featuring local vendors, Marcus found himself standing near the Webers in line for a Salvadoran pupusa stall. The moment could have been awkward, laden with the weight of their shared history. Instead, it felt surprisingly normal, 3 community members enjoying a sunny afternoon, connected by more than just a remembered confrontation. Their brief conversation wasn't forced or performative, but simply human. Comments about which food stalls had the longest lines, recommendations based on previous tastings, observations about the impressive turnout despite threatening weather. As they parted ways, Karen hesitated before speaking. "I wanted you to know," she said to Marcus, her voice quiet but steady, "that day changed us. Not immediately and not perfectly, but fundamentally. It wasn't a bid for absolution or praise, just a simple acknowledgement of impact, offered without expectation of response." Marcus nodded, recognizing the courage it took to reference that day directly, to acknowledge transformation without claiming its completion. "That's all any of us can hope for," he replied. "To be changed for the better by the people and experiences we encounter, even the difficult ones. Maybe especially those." The true measure of transformation wasn't in grand gestures or public declarations, but in these small moments of authentic connection. evidence that what had once seemed impossible had become, if not easy, then at least imaginable. A community where differences didn't disappear but were engaged with honesty and respect, where mistakes were acknowledged rather than denied, where growth was valued over perfection. The work would continue, unfinished and ongoing, sustained not by dramatic confrontations, but by the accumulated effect of countless individual choices to see others more fully and respond more humanely than before.